Hey there. Tonight, we're going to explore the story of a ruler who married his own sister to keep power, a tale from the sun-drenched land of ancient Egypt. As you settle in, ready to unwind or perhaps drift off to sleep, it's good to have you here with us. It's always so interesting to see where our fellow history travelers are settling in for the night. So feel free to leave a comment with where you're listening from, and perhaps consider subscribing if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past. We'll explore not just why a king would make such a choice, but what it felt like to live in a world where it was not just accepted, but celebrated as divine. So, let's go there now. Imagine yourself standing on a balcony, overlooking a city unlike any other in the world. The air that washes over you is warm, thick with the scent of the nearby sea, a salty tang that mingles with something else, the sweet perfume of lotus blossoms from the palace gardens below, the dusty smell of sandstone, and the faint, ever-present aroma of spices from the bustling marketplace. This is Alexandria, in the 3rd century before the Common Era. It is the jewel of the Mediterranean, a city built on a dream, a city of marble and light. Below you, the Great Canopic Way, the city's main artery, is a river of humanity. You can hear the murmur of a dozen languages floating up from the crowds, the crisp, intellectual Greek of the ruling class, the ancient, flowing tongue of the native Egyptians, the clipped Aramaic of merchants from the east. It's a symphony of a world in motion, a place where continents and cultures collide. The sun is beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep violet, and its last rays catch the top of the Pharos, the great lighthouse, which stands like a silent sentinel at the harbor's edge. Soon, its massive beacon will ignite, a man-made star to guide ships home, a testament to the ambition of the men who rule this city, the men who rule Egypt. And their ambition, as we shall see, knows very few bounds. They are called the Ptolemies. They are not Egyptian, not by blood. They are Greeks, Macedonians, the heirs of one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. They seized this ancient land of gods and pharaohs, and now they hold it with a grip that is both powerful and perpetually insecure. And it is this insecurity, this constant, nagging fear of being seen as foreign invaders, that will lead them down a very strange and winding path. A path that leads a brother to look upon his sister not just as a sibling, but as a queen, a wife, and a goddess. The air grows cooler as night begins to fall, and the sounds of the city soften, becoming a gentle hum. In the palace behind you, torches are being lit, casting flickering shadows on walls covered in intricate mosaics that tell stories of Greek gods and heroes, a world away from the crocodile and ibis-headed deities that the people outside these walls have worshipped for millennia. It is in this space between two worlds, between the Greek mind and the Egyptian soul, that our story takes place. A story of power, of legacy, and of a love that was either the most sacred bond or the most calculated political merger in history. Or, perhaps, it was both. For now, just listen to the hum of the city, feel the sea breeze on your skin, and let the great, slow turning of history begin. The Ptolemies believed they were carrying the torch of Hellenic civilization, a beacon of logic and philosophy in what they considered a world of superstition. Yet, to hold on to this land, they would have to embrace a tradition that would have sent a shudder through the streets of Athens. They would have to become more Egyptian than the Egyptians, at least on the surface. And nothing was more Egyptian, more divine, more pharaonic than the union of a brother and a sister on the throne. The idea was simple, in its own grand, unsettling way. The gods did it. Osiris, the great king of the underworld, married his sister Isis, the mother of all magic. From their union came Horus, the falcon-headed god who legitimized the rule of every pharaoh that followed. If you are to be a living god on earth, as the pharaohs were, then you must act as the gods do. Your bloodline is not mortal, it is divine. A river of gold that cannot be diluted by mingling with lesser streams. It's a powerful piece of propaganda, a story that wraps your rule in the sacred linens of ancient tradition. And for the Ptolemies, a family of foreigners in a land that had seen dynasties rise and fall like the cycles of the Nile's flood, This was a story they desperately needed to learn how to tell. Let's stay here on this balcony for a little while longer, watching as the real stars begin to appear in the ink-black sky, outshining the lamps and torches of the city below. The sheer scale of Alexandria is something to behold. It was not an ancient city that grew organically over centuries, like a gnarled old tree. It was planned. It was imposed upon the landscape by Alexander the Great himself, designed on a grid system, a model of Hellenistic rationalism stamped onto the edge of the African continent. This was a statement, a declaration that a new order had arrived. His general, Ptolemy, the first of his name to rule Egypt, chose it as his capital. A clever choice. It was in Egypt, but not entirely of Egypt. It faced the Mediterranean, its back to the vast, mysterious desert interior. It was a gateway, a bridge, a place where Greek ships could dock without having to navigate the treacherous silt-filled delta of the Nile. It was a city that looked outward, towards the Greek world, the world the Ptolemies understood and belonged to. But the source of their immense wealth, the thing that paid for the marble temples, the soaring lighthouse, and the salaries of the thousands of Greek soldiers who kept them in power, was Egypt itself. The endless fields of grain, the gold mines in the eastern desert, the taxes collected from millions of native Egyptians who lived their lives much as their ancestors had for 3,000 years. The Ptolemies were, in essence, sitting on a giant treasure chest, but they never quite felt like they had the key. They were perpetually balancing on a knife's edge. On one side, they had to present themselves to the Greek world as champions of Hellenism, sophisticated patrons of art and science. On the other, they had to convince the Egyptian people that they were the rightful successors to the pharaohs, the divine intermediaries between the gods and mortals. It was an impossible balancing act, a political tightrope walk that stretched for 3 centuries. Imagine a man named Demetrios, a Greek scribe working in the great library. He spends his days carefully copying the plays of Sophocles and the histories of Herodotus onto fresh scrolls of papyrus. The air in the library is cool and quiet, smelling of dry paper and cedarwood oil. For Demetrios, Alexandria is the center of the universe, a beacon of reason. He discusses philosophy in the colonnades and marvels at the mechanical inventions being developed in the Mausoleum, the great research institute attached to the library. He sees the Egyptians who work as laborers and servants as a backdrop, an ancient, unchanging part of the scenery. He might find their animal-headed gods quaint, even a little ridiculous. The idea of worshipping a cat or a crocodile is, to his logical Greek mind, absurd. Now, imagine a man named Ken-Amun, an Egyptian priest from a nearby temple of Serapis. Serapis himself is a perfect example of this cultural fusion, a new god created by the Ptolemies, combining the Egyptian Osiris Apis with Greek gods like Zeus and Hades, designed to appeal to both populations. Ken-Amun sees the Greeks as powerful, certainly, but also as noisy, arrogant, and strangely disconnected from the rhythm of the land. He knows that the Nile is not just a river, but a god. He knows the incantations that must be sung to ensure a good harvest. He sees the world as a complex tapestry of divine forces, a world the Greeks, with all their logic, fail to comprehend. These two men, Demetrios and Ken-Amun, live in the same city, walk the same streets, but they inhabit entirely different realities. The challenge for the Ptolemaic kings was to be king to both of them, and so they hedged their bets. They built Greek-style temples and gymnasia. They funded the library, making Alexandria the intellectual capital of the world. But they also had themselves depicted on temple walls in the traditional style of the pharaohs, smiting their enemies, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. They participated in Egyptian religious festivals. They gave money to the ancient priesthoods. It was a dual strategy, a public performance with two very different audiences. And it is within this context of calculated performance that the decision of a king to marry his sister begins to shift from a bizarre, shocking act to a piece of carefully considered, if extreme, political theater. It was a message, sent in 2 different languages at the same time. To the Greeks, it might have been whispered about as a strange, decadent, Eastern custom. the kind of thing that happens when you spend too long away from home. But to the Egyptians, it was a clear and powerful signal. The rulers were finally behaving like proper pharaohs. They were embracing the sacred traditions of the land. They were becoming gods. The founder of this dynasty, Ptolemy II, which translates to Ptolemy the Savior, was a far more straightforward man than his descendants would become. He was a soldier first and foremost, one of Alexander's boyhood friends and most capable commanders. When Alexander the Great died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BC, leaving a vast empire with no clear heir, his generals, the Diadochi, or successors, immediately began carving it up for themselves. It was the beginning of decades of brutal, backstabbing warfare. Ptolemy, shrewd and cautious, made a beeline for the richest and most defensible province of them all, Egypt. His most audacious act was arguably hijacking Alexander's funeral procession. The great conqueror's body was being transported back to Macedonia for burial, encased in a golden sarcophagus. Ptolemy intercepted it and brought it to Egypt. It was a masterstroke of public relations. Possessing the body of the deified Alexander conferred enormous legitimacy. He was, in effect, claiming to be the true heir to Alexander's legacy. He buried the body first in Memphis, the ancient Egyptian capital, and later moved it to a magnificent tomb in Alexandria. For the rest of his reign, Ptolemy I some his rival generals, and setting up the administrative systems that would make his family fabulously wealthy for generations. He was a practical man. He established the cult of Serapis, as we mentioned, and laid the groundwork for the library and the Mausoleum. He married several times, all to respectable Macedonian noblewomen, producing a number of children. The idea of marrying his own sister would likely have been as abhorrent to him as it would have been to any other Greek of his time. It was a taboo associated with the Persians, their great enemies, and with the mythical, tragic figures of Greek drama, like Oedipus. For Ptolemy I, being Greek was his identity. It was what set him apart, what made him a conqueror. He was not trying to go native. He was trying to rule Egypt as a Macedonian king. The world he created was one of Hellenistic efficiency, layered over pharaonic tradition. He issued coins with his own face on them, a new and somewhat arrogant practice for a Greek ruler, but one that established his personal authority. He was a king, not just a regent. He declared himself pharaoh to the Egyptians, but to the Greeks, he was King Ptolemy. It was his son, Ptolemy II, who would take the dynasty and the concept of kingship into much stranger territory. Ptolemy I laid the foundation, a solid, pragmatic base of military strength and economic control. His son would build a glittering, decadent, and intellectually vibrant superstructure upon it, but he would do so using architectural principles that would have baffled his father. The first Ptolemy's goal was to secure the kingdom. The second Ptolemy's goal was to define it, to elevate it, to make it not just a kingdom, but a divine institution. And to do that, he would look not only to the traditions of his Macedonian ancestors, but also to the far more ancient and far more theatrical traditions of the pharaohs he now claimed to be. The transition from father to son was, itself, a little unusual. Ptolemy I had an older son, Ptolemy Keranos, by his first wife. But he was passed over in favor of the younger Ptolemy, his son with his favored wife, Berenice I. This preference for the son of a specific favored wife would become a recurring theme in the dynasty, adding yet another layer of intrigue and instability to the family tree. The rejected son, Keranos, which means thunderbolt, would go on to have a violent and chaotic career of his own, briefly seizing the throne of Macedonia before being killed in battle. It's a small, early glimpse into the ruthless family dynamics that would come to characterize the Ptolemies. This was not a warm and fuzzy family. This was a nest of vipers, where sibling rivalry could, and often did, escalate to exile and assassination. And in such an environment, an alliance with a sibling, if it could be trusted, was potentially the most powerful alliance of all. As the second Ptolemy, whose official epithet would become Philadelphus, or sister lover, grew into his power, the city of Alexandria blossomed around him. He was not a warrior like his father. He was a man of culture, of intellect, and of extravagant tastes. His reign is often considered the golden age of Alexandria. He poured money into the library, attracting the greatest minds from across the Greek-speaking world. Scholars, poets, mathematicians, and astronomers flocked to his court, drawn by generous stipends and the promise of access to an unrivaled collection of knowledge. It was under his patronage that the Hebrew scriptures were first translated into Greek, the famous Septuagint. It was a project that speaks to the cosmopolitan nature of his city and his own intellectual curiosity. He also had a passion for the exotic. He sent expeditions down the Red Sea and into Africa, bringing back not just trade goods, but strange and wonderful animals. His grand procession, the Ptolemaic, held every 4 years, was a spectacle of almost unimaginable opulence, designed to awe both his own subjects and foreign ambassadors. Imagine endless parades of soldiers in gleaming armor, floats bearing massive golden statues of the gods, and a procession of animals that was like a living encyclopedia. Elephants, rhinoceroses, leopards, and even, it is said, a giraffe. An animal so strange it must have seemed like something from a dream. This was Ptolemy II showing off. He was projecting an image of limitless wealth and power, the benevolent ruler of a peaceful and prosperous kingdom. A kingdom so rich it could afford to spend a fortune on a party. But beneath the glittering surface, the old anxieties remained. The nagging question of legitimacy, the need to keep the native Egyptian population quiescent and the powerful priesthoods on his side. He, like his father, continued the dual policy. To the Greeks, he was the great patron of Hellenic culture. To the Egyptians, he was Pharaoh, the son of Ra. And he began to notice something. In the long, long history of the pharaohs, the ones who were most revered, most divine, often emphasized the purity of their bloodline. The stories of brother-sister marriages among the gods were not just myths. They were a blueprint for divine kingship on earth. Take Akhenaten, the heretic king, who married his half-sister Nefertiti, or Ramesses the Great, who took several of his own daughters as secondary wives. While full sibling marriage for the throne was not as common in the pharaonic period as is sometimes believed, it was present, and the idea of keeping the royal blood within the family was a well-established principle. The divine essence of the king was not something to be shared lightly with outsiders. Ptolemy II was a student of these things. He had the best library in the world at his disposal, and scribes who could read the ancient hieroglyphs. He understood the power of symbolism. He was also surrounded by a court culture that was becoming increasingly insular. The Ptolemies in Alexandria lived in a gilded cage. They socialized primarily with other Greeks and Macedonians. They were a small, foreign elite ruling over a vast, native population. The temptation to see themselves as a separate, superior caste of people was immense. It's a dynamic you see throughout history, with colonial rulers everywhere. They create their own exclusive clubs, their own social bubbles, to reinforce their sense of identity and separation. For the Ptolemies, this instinct would eventually lead them to the most exclusive club of all, a dynasty that only married itself. But before Ptolemy II could make this radical leap, he had a wife. A perfectly respectable and politically advantageous first wife. Her name was Arsinoe, but she is known to history as Arsinoe II. She was the daughter of Lysimachus, another of Alexander's successors, and a powerful king in his own right. The marriage was a standard political alliance, designed to cement a treaty between two powerful Hellenistic kingdoms. It was a good match. She gave him 3 children, including his heir, the future Ptolemy III. By all accounts, it was a normal royal marriage for the time, functional, political, and dynastic. But there was another woman who would soon enter the picture, a woman who was far from a quiet, conventional queen, a woman who was, in fact, Ptolemy's own full-blooded sister, and her name, confusingly, was also Arsinoe. To understand the marriage of Ptolemy II and his sister, Arsinoe II, you have to understand Arsinoe II herself. She was not some passive princess given away in a political arrangement. She was one of the most formidable women of her age, a queen in her own right, long before she ever returned to Egypt. Her life was a whirlwind of Hellenistic court intrigue, a brutal game of thrones where she was a major player. Like her brother, she was the child of Ptolemy I and his favored wife, Berenice. At the tender age of about 16, she was married off to the aforementioned Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, a powerful but aging warlord who was a contemporary of her father. Arsinoe II was his third wife, and she walked into a court already seething with dynastic tension. Lysimachus had a handsome and popular son, Agathocles, from a previous marriage, who was the heir apparent. Arsinoe, ambitious and determined to see her own sons on the throne, saw him as a threat. What happened next is murky, a classic case of historical gossip and accusation. The ancient sources, often hostile to powerful women, accuse her of plotting against her stepson. They claim she convinced her aging husband that Agathocles was treasonously conspiring with a rival king. Whether it was her manipulation, Lysimachus's own paranoia, or a genuine plot, the result was the same. Lysimachus had his own son, his heir, executed. It was a catastrophic decision. The act horrified his subjects and his allies. His kingdom was thrown into turmoil, and his most powerful rival, Seleucus I, another of the original successors, saw his chance and invaded. Lysimachus was killed in battle. His kingdom collapsed. Arsinoe II, now a widow, was forced to flee. But she was not done. She was a Ptolemy, after all, and possessed a full measure of the family's ambition and resilience. She sought refuge in Macedon, the ancestral homeland, and there, in a truly bizarre and ruthless move, she married her own half-brother, Ptolemy Keranos. Yes, the same thunderbolt who had been passed over for the Egyptian throne in favor of her other brother. This was not a marriage of affection. It was a cold, hard political calculation on both sides. He was a king without a kingdom, and she was a queen with sons who had a claim to one. He needed her legitimacy and connections. She needed his protection and power. The alliance lasted only a few months. It ended in betrayal and bloodshed. Ptolemy Keranos, securing his own position, turned on her. He had her 2 young sons by Lysimachus murdered right in front of her. She was once again forced to flee for her life, having lost her husband, her kingdom, and now her children. She had only one place left to go: home. She made her way to Alexandria, to the court of her younger, full-blooded brother, Ptolemy II. Imagine her arrival. A woman in her late 30s, no longer a young princess, but a seasoned, scarred veteran of the brutal world of Hellenistic politics. She had been a queen 3 times over, had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had outmaneuvered rivals and been brutally betrayed. She was not returning as a supplicant seeking charity. She was returning as a player, looking for a new game. And in the glittering, sophisticated, but perhaps somewhat naive court of her brother, she found it. She arrived to find her brother married to Arsinoe I, who had just borne him his heir. For a woman of Arsinoe II's ambition, this was an obstacle. And, just as she had allegedly done in the court of Lysimachus, she moved to eliminate the rival. Soon after her arrival in Alexandria, accusations of a conspiracy were leveled against Queen Arsinoe I. She was accused of plotting to assassinate Ptolemy II. The charges were convenient, to say the least. It's impossible to know the truth. Was Arsinoe I guilty? Or was she framed by the far more experienced and ruthless Arsinoe II? Whatever the reality, the outcome was swift. Arsinoe I was exiled to Koptos, a town in Upper Egypt. Her children were, for the moment, set aside. The stage was now clear. With his first wife conveniently exiled, Ptolemy II was free to remarry. And the bride he chose was the woman who had just arrived at his court, the woman who had seen and survived it all, his sister, Arsinoe II. Sometime around the year 275 BC, the king of Egypt married his full sister. The act would have sent shockwaves through the Greek world. It was unprecedented for a Macedonian ruler. It violated deeply held social and religious taboos. It was the kind of thing the heroes of tragic plays did, and it never ended well for them. The poet Sotates, a contemporary at the court in Alexandria, famously wrote a scathing line about the marriage. "You have thrust your staff into an unholy hole." Ptolemy II, who for all his patronage of the arts did not appreciate being the butt of the joke, had him arrested. Sotades escaped, was recaptured, and, according to the story, was sealed in a leaden jar and thrown into the sea. It was a clear message. The king was not to be mocked. This was not a matter for public debate. This was a divine act. The propaganda machine of the Ptolemaic state went into overdrive. The couple were given the official title Philadelphus, which means the sibling lovers. It wasn't a name given to them by their enemies. It was a name they chose for themselves. They were leaning into it, owning it. They declared themselves to be the living embodiment of the divine couple, Isis and Osiris. This was the justification, the story they told the world, and perhaps the story they told themselves. To the native Egyptians, this was a powerful and resonant message. The new rulers were finally aligning themselves with the most ancient traditions of the land. They were closing the circle, purifying the bloodline, behaving as true gods on earth should. In the temples of Karnak and Philae, it would have been seen as a return to cosmic order. Priests could now point to the ruling couple and see a reflection of the divine family they had always worshipped. It was a political masterstroke, a way of anchoring their foreign dynasty firmly in the rich soil of Egyptian mythology. For the Greeks of Alexandria, the justification had to be different. They couldn't be sold on the Isis and Osiris story. For them, the message was more about Greek deities. The couple were also associated with the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, the divine twins. More importantly, the marriage was framed as an act that ensured the stability and strength of the kingdom. By keeping the royal power and wealth concentrated within the immediate family, they were preventing the dilution of their authority. Hellenistic kingdoms were notoriously unstable, often torn apart by succession crises and the competing claims of in-laws from other royal houses. Ptolemy's first marriage, to the daughter of Lysimachus, was a prime example of how such alliances could go sour. By marrying his sister, Ptolemy II was, in a way, insulating his kingdom from the chaotic world of international royal politics. He was creating a closed system. The message was, the House of Ptolemy is self-sufficient. We need no outside alliances. Our power comes from within. It was a declaration of strength and exceptionalism. The marriage was not just a private matter. It was a public spectacle. Coins were minted showing their two profiles, side by side, co-rulers. Arsinoe II was not depicted as a demure consort, slightly behind her husband. She was his equal, sharing the frame. She was granted titles and honors unprecedented for a Ptolemaic queen. She was made co-regent. She had cities named after her. She was, in every meaningful way, a ruler of Egypt alongside her brother. This was not just Ptolemy II taking a wife. This was Ptolemy II taking on a business partner, a very, very capable one. And Arsinoe II, after a lifetime of precarious queenship in foreign, hostile courts, had finally come home and secured the ultimate position of power. She was no longer a pawn in the games of men. She was a queen, a goddess, and the wife of the richest king in the world. She had won. Let's imagine a quiet evening in the royal palace in Alexandria. The grand feasts and public ceremonies are over for the day. The courtiers have retired to their quarters, their whispers and intrigues momentarily silenced. In a private chamber, overlooking a moonlit garden filled with the scent of jasmine, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II are sitting together. He is no longer the magnificent king, the living god, but a man in his late 30s, perhaps a little weary from the constant performance of power. She is no longer the formidable goddess queen, but a woman in her early 40s, her face etched with the lines of a life that has been anything but easy. What do they talk about? We can never know, of course. This is the space where history falls silent, leaving us only with the echo of public acts. But we can imagine. Perhaps they don't talk about love, not in the way we might think of it. Their relationship was forged in the cold fire of political necessity and dynastic ambition. But maybe, in this quiet room, they talk about something that can feel a lot like love, trust. He is a king surrounded by flatterers and schemers. Every general, every courtier, every foreign ambassador wants something from him. His first wife was accused of plotting his death. His own half-brother was a murderous rival. In this world of shifting allegiances and hidden daggers, who can you truly trust? Perhaps the answer was the one person whose ambitions were now perfectly, inextricably aligned with his own. His sister. Her success was his success. His power was her power. An enemy to the throne of Ptolemy was an enemy to them both. They were a team. She, with her hard-won experience of the brutal realities of Hellenistic politics, could offer him counsel that no one else could. She had seen kingdoms crumble from within. She understood betrayal. She could spot a threat a mile away. He, with his vast resources and intellectual curiosity, could give her the platform and security she had sought her entire life. Together, they were far more powerful than they were apart. Perhaps they discussed matters of state. She might advise him on a treaty with the Seleucid Empire, her knowledge of their court dynamics proving invaluable. He might tell her about a new manuscript acquired for the library, a lost play by Euripides, and they might share a moment of intellectual connection. She became deeply involved in the foreign and domestic policy of the kingdom. The ancient sources, even those hostile to her, admit her influence was immense. She was a patron of the arts, a canny diplomat, and a shrewd financial manager. The economic prosperity of Ptolemy II's reign owed a great deal to her acumen. They ruled together for about 5 years, a period of remarkable stability and prestige for Egypt. They were the ultimate power couple. The branding was flawless. The brother-sister gods, the Theoi, became a central part of the state and ruler cult. This wasn't just a title, it was a religious institution. Priests were appointed, temples were dedicated, and festivals were held in their honor. When you deify yourself while you are still alive, you are playing a very high-stakes game. You are essentially claiming that you are infallible. It's the ultimate expression of absolute monarchy, and it worked. The cult of the Theoi became deeply embedded in Egyptian life and would be continued by their successors. It gave the Ptolemaic dynasty the divine gloss it had been searching for. It solved their central problem of legitimacy. By marrying his sister, Ptolemy II was not descending into barbarism, as his Greek critics might have seen it. From his perspective, he was ascending to divinity. It was a radical solution to a unique problem, and at the heart of it was this strange, complex relationship between a brother and a sister who became husband and wife, partners in power, and gods on earth. In the quiet of their palace, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, they may have found not a passionate romance, but something rarer and perhaps more valuable in their world, a perfect, unbreakable alliance. The concept of divine right, of a ruler chosen by God or the gods, is a powerful one that has echoed through history, from the pharaohs to the emperors of China and the kings of Europe. But the Ptolemies took it a step further. They didn't just claim their right to rule came from the gods. They claimed they were gods. This wasn't just a metaphor. The ruler cult they established was a very real and very important part of the state's machinery. It required infrastructure, personnel, and a significant budget. Let's think about how this worked on a practical level. A farmer named Pasher, living in a small village up the Nile, might never see the king or queen. Alexandria was a world away. His life was governed by the rhythm of the river, the sun, and the demands of the local tax collector. But he would encounter the ruler cult every day. In the local temple, alongside the ancient statues of Horus and Anubis, there would now be a statue of Ptolemy and Arsinoe, depicted as Osiris and Isis. When he paid his taxes, a portion of it might be designated for the upkeep of the local priest of the divine Ptolemies. The coins he used to buy bread would have their faces on them, a constant, tangible reminder of who was in charge. When a royal decree was read out in the village square, it would begin with an invocation of their divine names. The cult was a way of projecting the king's presence into every corner of the kingdom. It was a form of mass communication, a branding exercise on an epic scale. It helped to unify a diverse and sprawling kingdom under a single, shared ideology. By participating in the cult, by offering a prayer or a small sacrifice to the statues of the king and queen, people like Pasher were actively affirming their loyalty to the state. It was a system that blurred the lines between religion and politics until they were one and the same. To be a good Egyptian was to honor the gods, and the king and queen were now officially part of the pantheon. This was particularly effective because it tapped into a religious framework that was already thousands of years old. The Egyptians were accustomed to the idea of a divine pharaoh. The Ptolemies, by inserting themselves into this tradition, were essentially hijacking an existing belief system for their own purposes. And the marriage of Ptolemy and Arsinoe was the master key that unlocked it. Without the sibling marriage, their claim to be the new Isis and Osiris would have been far less convincing. The marriage was the proof, the ultimate performance of their pharaonic credentials. For the Greek population of Alexandria, the cult had a slightly different flavor. They were less likely to see Ptolemy as a literal god, in the same way an Egyptian farmer might. But the ruler cult was a familiar concept in the Hellenistic world as well, evolving from the practice of honoring heroic founders of cities. For a Greek living in Alexandria, participating in the state cult was more a matter of civic duty and loyalty, a bit like a modern citizen saluting the flag or singing a national anthem. It was a way of showing you were a good subject of the king. Refusing to participate could be seen as treasonous. The poet Sotades learned that the hard way. So the cult served two purposes, speaking two different cultural languages. To the Egyptians, it was a profound religious statement. To the Greeks, it was a profound political one. And for the Ptolemies themselves, it was the perfect solution, a way to be all things to all people. The level of detail in their branding was remarkable. They didn't just call themselves sibling lovers. They created a whole mythology around it. Arsinoe II was particularly associated with the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, but also with Isis. She was also linked to Tyche, the goddess of good fortune. She was presented as a universal goddess, a divine figure who could protect the kingdom, ensure its prosperity, and guarantee the love and harmony of the royal family. It was a carefully constructed image of feminine power, but a power that was always tied to her role as wife and sister to the king. She was powerful, but her power reinforced his. They were a divine unit, indivisible. This elaborate system of belief, built around this one controversial marriage, would become the bedrock of Ptolemaic rule for the next 2.5 centuries, a testament to the strange but effective genius of its architects. The reign of the Theoi Adelphoi, the brother-sister gods, was marked by more than just clever propaganda. It was a period of significant achievement. With a stable home front and a trusted co-ruler, Ptolemy II was able to pursue an ambitious foreign policy. Egypt engaged in the First Syrian War against their great rivals, the Seleucid Empire, a conflict that was largely about controlling the lucrative trade routes of the Eastern Mediterranean. While the war was a messy and inconclusive affair, Egypt held its own, securing its sphere of influence and asserting itself as the dominant naval power in the Aegean Sea. Arsinoe II's role in these matters was not passive. She had her own fleet. She had her own resources. She actively participated in the strategic decisions of the kingdom. This was highly unusual for a Hellenistic queen. Most queens, even powerful ones, wielded their influence from behind the throne, through their sons or their husbands. Arsinoe ruled from a throne right beside her brothers. She was the first Ptolemaic queen to have her own coinage issued, a clear sign of her independent status and economic power. Her face on a coin meant her authority was literally currency. Domestically, their joint reign saw massive investment in infrastructure. They undertook huge land reclamation projects in the Fayum Oasis, a large, fertile depression west of the Nile. By improving irrigation, they created vast new tracts of farmland, which they then settled with Greek and Macedonian military veterans. This was another clever move. It increased agricultural output, meaning more wealth for the state, and it also created a loyal population of Greek-speaking landowners in the heart of Egypt, a military reserve that could be called upon if needed. It was a way of tightening their grip on the country, acre by acre. The city of Alexandria itself continued to be their showpiece. The Mausoleum and library were not just cultural institutions. They were instruments of state power. By gathering all the world's knowledge under one roof, the Ptolemies were making a statement. Alexandria is the center of the world. All intellectual roads lead here. They sponsored scholars like the poet Callimachus, who began the monumental task of cataloging the library's entire collection, and the mathematician Euclid, whose elements would become the foundational text of geometry for 2,000 years. This wasn't just about a love of learning, it was about prestige. In the competitive world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, having the best poets and the smartest mathematicians was like having the biggest battleships. It was a form of soft power. It attracted talent, it enhanced their reputation, and it made their court the place to be. We can imagine Ptolemy and Arsinoe reviewing the plans for a new canal, or discussing the latest acquisition for the library, a rare scroll from Athens. Their partnership seems to have been a productive fusion of his intellectualism and her pragmatism. He had the grand vision. She had the political savvy to make it happen. She understood the world of power in a way he, who had always been a prince and then a king, perhaps did not. She knew that power was not just inherited, it had to be constantly taken, defended, and demonstrated. Their combined skills made them a formidable ruling pair. Of course, we must be careful not to romanticize it. Their world was built on a system of extraction. The fabulous wealth that funded the library and the wars came from the relentless taxation of the Egyptian peasantry. The lives of the millions of people who actually farmed the land were likely hard and short. They were the silent engine that drove the glittering machine of the Ptolemaic state. While the king and queen were deifying themselves in Alexandria, a farmer in a distant province was likely more concerned about whether the Nile flood would be high enough and whether he could meet the tax collector's quota. But for the Ptolemies, this was simply the natural order of things. They were the shepherds, and the people were their flock, a resource to be managed for the good of the state, which was, of course, synonymous with the good of the dynasty. The brother-sister marriage, in this context, was the ultimate symbol of this closed, self-referential system. The dynasty existed for its own sake, its purity and power a goal in and of itself. After only about 5 years of this extraordinary co-rule, in the year 270 or 268 BC, Arsinoe II died. She was likely in her mid-40s. Her death must have been a profound blow to Ptolemy II, both personally and politically. He had lost not just his wife and sister, but his most trusted advisor and co-ruler. His reaction to her death is perhaps the most telling evidence of her importance. He did not simply mourn her and move on. He did not remarry. Instead, he launched a campaign to elevate her to an even higher level of divinity than she had enjoyed in life. This was the beginning of the official, state-sponsored cult of Arsinoe Philadelphus. It was a posthumous cult, but it was promoted with all the resources of the kingdom. It was as if, in death, she became even more powerful, her divine essence now fully released from its mortal vessel. Ptolemy had her formally deified. He established priesthoods and built temples in her honor all across Egypt and even in the Greek islands under his control. A new religious festival, the Arsinoe, was created. Entire towns were renamed in her honor. He even retroactively declared that his children by his first wife, the exiled Arsinoe I, were in fact the children of Arsinoe II. This was a legal and religious fiction, of course, but it was a powerful one. It erased the inconvenient first wife from the official narrative and cemented the image of the perfect, divine sibling union as the foundation of the dynasty. His heir, the future Ptolemy III, would now officially be the son of the goddess Arsinoe II. This act ensured that her legacy and her bloodline, intertwined with his, would continue to rule Egypt. The cult of Arsinoe became incredibly popular, enduring for centuries. She was worshipped as a goddess who brought good fortune, protected sailors, and answered prayers. Her image, often holding a double cornucopia, a symbol of abundance, became one of the most recognizable icons of the era. Why did Ptolemy do all this? Was it a manifestation of profound grief and love? It's possible. Perhaps in their short time as co-rulers, a genuine and deep bond had formed, and this was his way of honoring her memory. Or was it, once again, a calculated political move? Also, very possible. By deifying his late wife so extravagantly, he was reinforcing his own divine status. He was the widower of a goddess, the earthly guardian of her cult. Her divine power reflected back on him. It also solidified the legitimacy of his heir. By making him the son of a goddess, his right to rule was beyond question. The most likely answer is that it was, as with everything in the Ptolemaic world, a mixture of both. Genuine emotion and shrewd politics were not mutually exclusive. They were two sides of the same golden coin. The legacy of their union was profound. They had established a new model for Ptolemaic kingship. The sibling marriage was no longer a shocking one-off event. It was now the template. It was the gold standard for the dynasty. Future Ptolemies would look back at the reign of the Theoi, Adelphoi, as a golden age of stability and prestige, and they would try to replicate it again and again. They had created a tradition, a bizarre and, in many ways, dysfunctional tradition that would define their family for the next 200 years, right down to its final, famous queen, Cleopatra. Ptolemy II's long reign continued for another 2 decades after his sister's death. He ruled as a solitary widower, forever associated with the goddess queen he had taken as his wife. His decision to marry her, born of a complex mix of dynastic anxiety, political calculation, and personal ambition, had reshaped his kingdom and his family's destiny. He had stared into the heart of a Greek taboo and, instead of turning away, had embraced it, wrapped it in gold and myth, and turned it into the cornerstone of his power. The tradition of sibling marriage, institutionalized by Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, would become a recurring, almost compulsive theme in the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was as if they had created a rulebook for themselves, and their descendants felt compelled to follow it, even when it led to disaster. The logic was always the same: to preserve the purity of the Macedonian bloodline and to reinforce the pharaonic, divine nature of their rule. But as the generations went on, the practice had some deeply corrosive effects. Genetically, while the risks of recessive disorders were not understood in modern scientific terms, the concentration of a limited gene pool likely had physical consequences. Many of the later Ptolemies were notoriously unhealthy and obese, but the more significant damage was political and social. The dynasty became increasingly detached from the world around them, a family locked in a gilded cage of its own making, marrying cousins and siblings, their world shrinking with each generation. The intense, insular nature of the family led to epic levels of dysfunction. While the union of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II seems to have been a successful partnership, later, sibling marriages were often characterized by bitter rivalry, hatred, and murder. The palace in Alexandria became a hotbed of conspiracy. Siblings who were supposed to rule jointly as husband and wife often ended up as mortal enemies, each trying to oust the other. Let's look a little further down the family tree. Ptolemy IV Philopator, which means father-lover, married his sister, Arsinoe III. Their reign was marked by decadence and a decline in administrative control. Unlike his great-grandfather, Ptolemy IV was not a particularly competent ruler. After his death, his powerful ministers had his sister wife, Arsinoe III, murdered so they could rule as regents for her young son. The pattern continues. Ptolemy VIII, Euergetes II, nicknamed Physcon, or Potbelly, due to his obesity, had a particularly sordid and complicated family life. He first married his sister, Cleopatra II. Then, he cast her aside and married her daughter, his own niece, who was named, you guessed it, Cleopatra III. For a time, all 3 of them were locked in a vicious civil war for control of Egypt. At one point, Physcon, in a fit of rage against his sister wife Cleopatra II, had their own son murdered, dismembered, and sent to her in a box as a gruesome birthday present. This is the stuff of the most lurid Gothic horror, not the stable, divine rule envisioned by Ptolemy II. The dynasty was, quite literally, consuming itself. The original purpose of the sibling marriage, to create stability and unity, had curdled into its opposite. It was now a catalyst for paranoia and civil war. The names become a confusing, repetitive list of Ptolemies and Cleopatras and Berenices, marrying their siblings, nieces, and nephews, their family tree turning into a tangled, thorny wreath. And all of this brings us, eventually, to the most famous member of the family, Cleopatra VII. The Cleopatra. Her own family life was a perfect embodiment of this toxic tradition. When her father died, his will stipulated that she should rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. As was tradition, they were married. She was about 18, he was about 10. Their joint rule was anything but harmonious. They were rivals from the start, backed by competing court factions. This rivalry led to a civil war that would eventually draw in the rising power of Rome in the person of Julius Caesar. Cleopatra, a brilliant and charismatic politician who spoke multiple languages, including, notably, Egyptian, a rare skill among the later Ptolemies, understood that the old model was failing. The dynasty could no longer survive as a closed system. It needed outside help. She famously aligned herself with Caesar, who defeated her brother-husband's forces. Ptolemy XIII conveniently drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. With her first brother-husband out of the way, Cleopatra was placed back on the throne by Caesar. But Roman sensibilities required a male co-ruler. So, she was compelled to marry her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. They were also declared joint rulers. It's not believed this marriage was ever consummated. He was a child, and she was busy having a famous love affair and a son with Julius Caesar. Her second brother-husband didn't last long either. He died shortly after Caesar's assassination, very likely poisoned on Cleopatra's orders to clear the way for her own son, Caesarion, to become her co-ruler. It was the final, ruthless act in a long family tradition of sibling rivalry. The practice that began with Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II as a grand statement of divine unity ended with Cleopatra methodically eliminating her brother-husbands to secure her own power. The arc of the dynasty shows how a tradition, once established, can take on a life of its own, continuing long after its original purpose has been lost, becoming a hollow and destructive ritual. Let's take a step back from the palace intrigue, from the gold and the poison, and wander back out into the streets of Alexandria. The sun is high in the sky now, beating down on the limestone buildings. The air is thick with the smells of baking bread, roasting fish, and the sweat of 1,000 dock workers down at the harbor. Life goes on, for the most part, indifferent to the bizarre family dramas playing out behind the palace walls. A merchant named Theron is haggling with a ship's captain from Rhodes over a cargo of wine. Theron is Greek, but his family has been in Egypt for 3 generations. He speaks Greek at home, but he knows enough Egyptian to deal with his servants and the farmers who supply his grain. Does he care that the king is married to his sister? Probably not very much. He cares about the stability of the currency. He cares that the harbor is safe from pirates. He cares that the grain shipments are not interrupted by a civil war. For Theron, the king and queen are distant figures on a coin. As long as business is good and the city is peaceful, their private lives are their own affair. Perhaps he finds it a bit strange, an odd Egyptian custom the royals have picked up, but it doesn't affect his bottom line. In fact, the reign of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II was probably very good for men like Theron. It was a time of peace and prosperity, of grand building projects and expanding trade. The state was strong, the administration was efficient, and the wealth of the kingdom was growing. From his perspective, whatever the royal couple was doing, it seemed to be working. Now let's wander into a different part of the city, away from the grand avenues and into the narrow, winding streets of the Egyptian quarter, Rakotis. Here, the buildings are made of mud brick, not marble. The air smells of cooking fires, livestock, and crowded humanity. A woman named Merit is grinding wheat in a small courtyard, her children playing at her feet. Her husband is a laborer, helping to build a new extension to the royal palace. For Merit, the Ptolemies are an undeniable presence. They are the ones who demand the taxes, the ones who conscript the labor for their grand projects. But she might also see them in a different light. When she goes to the local temple to make an offering, she sees their statues, depicted as the gods she has known her whole life. She might hear stories from the priests about the divine queen, Arsinoe, who is like a new Isis, a powerful mother goddess who can bring good fortune. Perhaps a drought has ended, or a plague has passed, and the priests will attribute it to the benevolence of the divine rulers. For Merit, the sibling marriage might not even register as strange. It's how the gods behave. It reinforces the idea that the rulers are truly powerful, tapped into the cosmic order of the universe. It might even be a source of comfort, a sign that the world is in its proper alignment. The shock and revulsion that a Greek intellectual or a Roman senator might feel would be completely alien to her. Her world is shaped by a different set of stories, a different understanding of what is sacred and what is profane. This vast gulf in perception is key to understanding the Ptolemaic kingdom. It wasn't one society. It was at least two, living side by side, coexisting under one ruler, but inhabiting different mental universes. The genius of the Ptolemaic system, particularly in its early days, was its ability to bridge this gulf, to create a political and religious language that could be understood in different ways by both groups. The brother-sister marriage was perhaps the most potent symbol in this bilingual political dictionary. It was an act that could be read as a shocking transgression by one audience and a sacred duty by another. And for the rulers themselves, perhaps it eventually became a little of both, their own Greek sensibilities slowly eroding under the immense weight of pharaonic tradition and the intoxicating logic of absolute power. They began as Greeks playing the part of pharaohs, but after generations of living the role, the mask began to merge with the face. The story of the Ptolemies is, in many ways, a story about identity. What does it mean to be Greek when you are surrounded by Egypt? What does it mean to be a ruler when your subjects see you as both a foreign conqueror and a living god? The Ptolemies answered this question by creating a new, hybrid identity. They were Hellenistic pharaohs, a concept that was a contradiction in terms, and the sibling marriage became the ultimate expression of this contradiction. From a Greek perspective, maintaining the purity of the bloodline was important. Noble families in Athens or Macedon were careful about who they married, but they drew the line at incest. The Ptolemies took this Greek obsession with pure lineage and pushed it to an extreme, non-Greek conclusion. They justified it using an Egyptian religious model, creating something new and uniquely Ptolemaic. It's a fascinating example of cultural adaptation and invention. They were not simply going native and becoming Egyptian, nor were they remaining stubbornly Greek. They were selectively borrowing and blending elements from both cultures to create a system that served their specific needs. It was a creative, if deeply strange, solution to the problem of ruling a multicultural empire. This blending is visible everywhere in the art and architecture of the period. If you look at the statues of Ptolemaic rulers, you can see this dual identity at play. Some statues are purely Greek in style, depicting them as idealized Hellenistic kings with flowing hair and rational, composed expressions. Others are purely Egyptian, showing them in the stiff, formal poses of a pharaoh, wearing the traditional kilt and crown. And some are fascinating hybrids, with a Greek-style face on an Egyptian-style body. It's as if the sculptors were trying to visually represent this complex, dual nature of their rulers. The same is true of their religion. The official state cults, like that of Serapis or the divine siblings, were deliberate hybrids. But the Ptolemies were also careful not to interfere too much with the traditional Egyptian cults. They funded the ancient temples, respected the powerful priesthoods, and allowed the worship of gods like Horus, Thoth, and Anubis to continue uninterrupted. It was a policy of live and let live, as long as everyone acknowledged the supreme divinity of the ruling family. This delicate balancing act was successful for a long time. It allowed the Ptolemies to rule Egypt for nearly 300 years, a dynasty that lasted longer than most in Egypt's own long history. They outlasted their rival Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucids and the Antigonids, which collapsed much sooner. In a way, their strange, insular marriage strategy, which in the long run proved so destructive, may have contributed to their longevity in the short term. By not marrying into other royal families, they avoided being dragged into as many foreign wars and succession disputes. They kept their immense wealth within the family, not spending it on the dowries of princesses marrying foreign kings. They created a bubble, and for a while, it was a very strong and very shiny bubble. But bubbles, by their nature, are fragile. The world outside was changing. A new power was rising in the West, a power that was pragmatic, militaristic, and had very little patience for the elaborate, decadent world of the Hellenistic god-kings. The Romans were coming, and when they arrived, the strange, self-referential world of the Ptolemies would prove to be no match for their legions. The dynasty that began with a practical soldier hijacking a funeral procession would end with its last queen choosing the bite of an asp over the humiliation of being paraded in a Roman triumph. The story had come full circle, from conquest to conquest. Let's drift back for a moment to the heart of Ptolemaic power, the great library of Alexandria. It's not just a building full of scrolls, it's an idea. The idea that all knowledge can be collected, categorized, and contained in one place. It is the ultimate expression of the Greek rational mind, the belief in order and system. The librarians of Alexandria were obsessed with getting a perfect copy of every book ever written. The story goes that any ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor had to surrender any books on board. They would be taken to the library, copied by official scribes, and then the copy, not the original, would be returned to the owner. The library kept the original. It was a policy of intellectual appropriation on a grand scale, a reflection of the kingdom's power. Inside these quiet halls, scholars meticulously compared different versions of Homer's epics, trying to establish the definitive text. They mapped the stars, dissected human bodies to understand anatomy, and wrote vast encyclopedias of the natural world. This was one side of the Ptolemaic coin: logic, order, the pursuit of universal knowledge. But just a short walk away from the library was the royal palace, where the other side of the coin was being minted. Here, the ruling principle was not universalism, but a radical, divine exclusivity. The king was marrying his sister to create a bloodline so pure, so separate from the rest of humanity, that it could not be diluted. Here, the logic was not of this world. It was mythical, magical, borrowed from the oldest tales of the Egyptian gods. There is a deep and fascinating irony in this juxtaposition. The rulers who funded the most rational, scientific institution in the ancient world were simultaneously engaging in a practice that, to their own Greek intellectuals, would have seemed the height of irrationality. It's as if they compartmentalized their world. In the library, the laws of reason and evidence applied. In the palace, the laws of myth and divine right held sway. Ptolemy II Philadelphus embodies this contradiction perfectly. He was the great patron of the library, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity who conversed with poets and scientists, and he was also the man who married his sister and declared them both to be living gods, creating a cult that would have seemed like superstitious nonsense to many of the philosophers he supported. How did he reconcile these two worlds in his own mind? Perhaps he saw no contradiction at all. Perhaps he believed that the world of men and the world of gods operated on different principles. As a man, he could be a patron of science, but as a king, he was a god and had to act accordingly. Or perhaps he was simply the ultimate pragmatist. The library brought him prestige in the Greek world. The divine marriage brought him stability in the Egyptian one. Both were tools, instruments of statecraft, to be used to secure his power and legacy. We can imagine him walking through the colonnades of the Mausoleum, discussing astronomy with a scholar, and then returning to the palace to review the designs for a new temple dedicated to his sister wife, the goddess Arsinoe. For him, these were not conflicting activities. They were all part of the complex, multifaceted job of being a Hellenistic pharaoh. This dualism is what makes the Ptolemies so compelling. They were not simple tyrants. They were complex, educated, and in many ways, forward-thinking rulers who also engaged in practices we find bizarre and unsettling. They were champions of culture and pioneers of a state-sponsored religion built on incest. They were rationalists and mystics, Greeks and pharaohs, all at the same time. Their story reminds us that history is rarely a simple narrative of progress or decline. It is a messy, contradictory, and deeply human affair. Even when the humans involved claimed to be gods, the influence of Arsinoe II did not end with her death. In fact, her posthumous cult became one of the most significant religious phenomena of the era. She became a kind of universal goddess, absorbing the attributes of both Greek and Egyptian deities. For Egyptians, she was a new Isis, a benevolent mother figure. For Greeks, she was a new Aphrodite, a goddess of love and beauty, but also a protector of sailors, a vital role in a maritime empire. The Ptolemaic state actively promoted her cult, and it seems to have been genuinely popular. Shrines to the deified Arsinoe have been found all over the Mediterranean world. People would make offerings to her, asking for health, prosperity, or a safe voyage. She became a personal savior figure, a friendly face in the pantheon, a goddess who had once been a mortal woman and might therefore be more sympathetic to human troubles. The creation of this cult was one of the most successful ventures of Ptolemy II's reign. It provided a common religious focus for his diverse subjects and created a powerful female deity who was inextricably linked to the legitimacy of his dynasty. Every prayer offered to Arsinoe was an indirect affirmation of Ptolemaic rule. This focus on powerful queens became another hallmark of the dynasty. While the Greek world was generally patriarchal, the Ptolemaic court produced a succession of formidable and influential women. Starting with Arsinoe II, the queens of Egypt often wielded real political power. They were not just royal wives, they were co-rulers, regents, and political players in their own right. Women like Cleopatra II and III, who fought their own brother husbands for the throne, and Berenice IV, who briefly ruled on her own, were following a path first blazed by Arsinoe II. This tradition of powerful queens culminates, of course, in Cleopatra VII. She was the heir to this legacy. Her confidence, her political ambition, and her assumption that she had a right to rule were not an aberration. They were the product of a long line of Ptolemaic women who had refused to remain in the shadows. Cleopatra was arguably the most capable of them all, but she was operating within a well-established tradition. So, when Ptolemy II married his sister, he didn't just secure his own throne, he inadvertently set a precedent for female power that would echo through the rest of his dynasty's history. By making his sister his equal partner, by deifying her and creating a cult in her name, he created a space for royal women to exercise a degree of authority that was rare in the ancient world. Of course, this power was always precarious. It was often contested, and it frequently led to violence. The Ptolemaic queens had to be ruthless to survive, but the fact that they were in the game at all is significant. The story of Ptolemaic Egypt is not just a story of kings named Ptolemy. It is also a story of queens, many of them named Arsinoe, Berenice, and most famously, Cleopatra. And the matriarch of this line of powerful women, the one who established the template for the Ptolemaic queen, was Arsinoe II, the sister who became a wife, a co-ruler, and a goddess. Her shadow looms large over the entire dynasty, a testament to her extraordinary life and the enduring power of the cult she and her brother created. As the night deepens and the world outside your window grows quiet, let's allow our thoughts to drift. Let's think about the nature of power and the stories that people tell to justify it. The story of Ptolemy and Arsinoe is a story about power. It's about the raw, military power needed to seize a kingdom and the soft, narrative power needed to hold it. The Ptolemies understood that swords and spears were not enough. You also needed myths, symbols, and ceremonies. You needed a good story. And we are living gods, descended from the gods, and like them, we marry our siblings to preserve our divine essence, was a very good story. It was simple, it was dramatic, and it connected them to a tradition that was thousands of years old. It worked, for a time. But all stories eventually run out of steam. All dynasties eventually decay. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which began with such energy and creative genius, slowly crumbled from within. The sibling marriages, once a source of strength and unity, became a source of weakness and division. The immense wealth of Egypt was squandered on civil wars and extravagant lifestyles. The intellectual vibrancy of Alexandria faded. The Ptolemies became a parody of their former selves, obese, decadent, and cruel, clinging to the rituals of power long after the substance of it had disappeared. It's a slightly melancholic tale, like watching a magnificent building slowly fall into ruin. The foundations laid by Ptolemy I were strong. The structure built by Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II was glittering and brilliant, but the later generations failed to maintain it. They lived in the house their ancestors built, but they forgot how to repair the roof or reinforce the walls. They were consumed by their own mythology, trapped in a family drama of their own making. The world of the Ptolemies can feel very distant, a strange and alien place with its god-kings and sibling marriages. But some of the themes are timeless. The struggle for legitimacy, the use of propaganda, the way families can be both a source of strength and a crucible of destructive rivalry. These are stories that repeat throughout human history, in different forms. The desire to see ourselves as special, as separate, as pure than others, is a powerful human instinct. The Ptolemies just took that instinct to its logical and illogical extreme. They created a dynasty that was, by design, apart from the rest of humanity. And in the end, that isolation could not protect them. The real world, in the form of the Roman legions, eventually broke down the door. And so, the story of Ptolemy and Arsinoe is also a cautionary tale. A tale about the dangers of believing your own propaganda, of becoming so enamored with your own story that you lose touch with the world outside. It's a story about how even the most powerful and wealthy rulers are ultimately subject to the same forces of history as everyone else. Their golden age could not last forever. The light of the pharaohs would eventually go out. The great library would one day burn. And the divine bloodline of the Ptolemies would run its course, leaving behind only coins, statues, and the faint, fascinating echo of their strange and brilliant story. Let's imagine one final scene. We are standing in the ruins of a temple in the Egyptian desert. It is long after the Ptolemies, long after the Romans, long after their world has turned to dust. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the broken columns and faded inscriptions. A warm wind whispers through the stones, carrying the sand of centuries. On a section of a wall that is still standing, you can just make out a carving. It depicts a man and a woman. They are shown in the formal style of the pharaohs. He wears the double crown of Egypt. She wears the vulture headdress of a queen, surmounted by the horns of a cow and a sun disk, symbols associated with the goddesses Hathor and Isis. Their faces are serene, impassive, looking out into eternity. This could be any pharaoh and his queen from 3,000 years of history. But if you look closely at the Greek inscription carved beside them, you can read their names, Ptolemy and Arsinoe, and the title given to them, Theoi Adelphoi, the brother, sister gods. Here, in this remote, forgotten place, is the fossil of their story. The grand political project, the shocking marriage, the complex web of propaganda and belief, all distilled into this one quiet image. The carving has been weathered by time. The vibrant colors it once had are long gone, bleached away by millennia of sun, but the image remains. A testament to their ambition, their audacity, and their strange, successful attempt to become gods in the eyes of their people. It's a reminder that history is not just about dates and battles. It's about the ideas and beliefs that shape human lives. The belief that a ruler could be a god. The belief that a marriage between a brother and a sister could be a sacred act. These ideas may seem alien to us, but for a time, they were the organizing principles of a great and powerful kingdom. They were real. They mattered. They motivated people. They built cities. And they defined a dynasty. Standing here in the silence of the desert, you can almost feel the immense weight of that history. The sheer, overwhelming depth of time. The Ptolemies were just one chapter in the very long book of Egypt. They were a Greek chapter, a strange and fascinating interlude. They came, they ruled, they built, they deified themselves. And then they were gone, absorbed back into the sands from which their kingdom's wealth was drawn. And as the last light of the sun fades, and the first stars begin to appear in the vast, dark sky, the carved figures of the brother-sister gods seem to dissolve into the twilight. Their story is over, but the questions they raise linger in the quiet air. What is divine, and what is human? What is love, and what is power? And how do we tell the difference? The wind sighs through the ruins, carrying no answers, only the endless, soft whisper of the sand. The story of Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II can be seen through so many different lenses. For a political historian, it is a masterclass in dynastic consolidation, a brilliant, if unorthodox, solution to the problem of legitimacy that plagued all of Alexander's successors. By marrying his sister, Ptolemy II effectively cauterized his dynasty from the chaotic interplay of Hellenistic international relations. creating a stable, internal source of power that relied on its own manufactured divinity rather than on shifting foreign alliances. It was a move of profound political cynicism, or genius, depending on your perspective, that secured his family's rule over the wealthiest nation in the Mediterranean for another 2 centuries. It was, in the cold language of statecraft, a success. For a social historian, it's a fascinating case study in cultural syncretism. It's about how a ruling minority, the Macedonians, negotiated their identity while immersed in an ancient and powerful majority culture, the Egyptians. The sibling marriage wasn't a capitulation to Egyptian culture, but a selective appropriation of one of its most potent symbols for their own Hellenistic ends. They took a pharaonic concept, laundered it through the language of Greek divine myths like Zeus and Hera, who were also brother and sister, and repackaged it for their dual audiences. It speaks to the fluidity of identity and culture in the Hellenistic period, a time when the old, rigid boundaries between Greek and barbarian were beginning to blur, creating new, hybrid forms of art, religion, and politics. Alexandria itself was the laboratory for this experiment, and the royal marriage was its most daring and successful creation. For a psychologist, the story might be about family systems and the pathologies of power. It's a glimpse into a family that became so insular, so obsessed with its own purity and preservation, that it adopted a practice that is almost universally taboo. What does it do to the human mind to be told from birth that you are a living God? What does it do to a family dynamic when your sister is also your wife, your rival, and your business partner? The later history of the dynasty, with its endless cycle of sibling rivalry and murder, suggests that this closed system eventually became a pressure cooker, turning normal family tensions into matters of life and death. The story that began as a solution for Ptolemy II became a trap for his descendants. But for us, tonight, as we are letting the world fade away, perhaps it's best to see it simply as a story, a human story, despite the claims of divinity. It's a story about a brother and a sister, born into a world of immense privilege and immense danger. It's about a woman, Arsinoe, who endured unimaginable loss and betrayal, and fought her way back to the pinnacle of power. It's about a man, Ptolemy, a scholar and a patron of the arts, who made a decision that was both shocking and brilliant, a decision that would define his reign and his family for all time. We can strip away the layers of propaganda and religious justification, and at the core, we find 2 people navigating their extraordinary circumstances as best they could, using the tools available to them. Their tools just happen to be armies, treasuries, and the claim of godhood. Their story is a reminder that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Our task is not to judge them by our own standards, but to try to understand them in the context of their own world, a world where gods and mortals were not so far apart, and where a marriage could be both a sacrament and a political merger. Let's think about the texture of that world for a moment. Imagine the papyrus that the story of Sotades, the unfortunate poet, was written on. The reeds, harvested from the marshy banks of the Nile, split and laid in cross-hatched layers, pressed and dried under the hot Egyptian sun until they form a smooth, pale sheet. The scribe's pen, a sharpened reed itself, dips into a pot of black ink made from soot and gum. The Greek letters flow across the page, telling a story of power, poetry, and punishment. The scroll is then rolled up, tied with a linen cord, and placed in a wooden niche in the great library, alongside tens of thousands of other scrolls, a single story in a vast ocean of knowledge. Or imagine the coin bearing the double portrait of Ptolemy and Arsinoe. A lump of gold or silver, heated until it is soft, is placed between 2 carved bronze dies. A heavy hammer strikes the top die with immense force, impressing the images into the metal in a fraction of a second. On one side, the 2 royal profiles, his slightly in front of hers, both with the same strong jawline and regal bearing. On the other side, perhaps 2 cornucopias, the horns of plenty, overflowing with fruits and grains, a symbol of the wealth and prosperity their divine union supposedly guarantees. This small object, no bigger than your thumb, is a piece of powerful propaganda designed to be held in the hand, to be used in the marketplace. to carry the image of the rulers into every corner of their kingdom. It is a tangible piece of their story, a metal messenger that proclaims their power and divinity. Now imagine the stone of the temple wall where their images are carved. A massive block of sandstone, quarried from the cliffs at Gebel el-Silsila, floated hundreds of miles down the Nile on a large barge. It is dragged into place by hundreds of laborers, their chants and grunts echoing in the dry air. A master craftsman then begins to carve, his bronze chisel and wooden mallet slowly chipping away at the stone, following a design drawn onto the surface in red ochre. He is not trying to create a realistic portrait in the Greek sense. He is following a sacred canon of proportions that has been used for 3,000 years. He is creating an icon, a hieroglyph of kingship. The finished product is not just a picture, it is an active presence, a place where the divine and earthly worlds can meet. These materials, papyrus, metal, and stone, are what's left of the Ptolemaic world. They are the physical remnants of their ideas, their ambitions, and their beliefs. They are silent witnesses to the story we have been exploring. They have outlasted the dynasty, the kingdom, and even the gods they were meant to honor. They are the footnotes to a story that was once written in flesh and blood, a story of a brother and a sister who dared to rule as gods. The sun has long set over Alexandria. The great light of the Pharos is now sweeping its beam across the dark waters of the Mediterranean, a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse of light. The city is quiet. The hum of the marketplace has faded, replaced by the distant barking of a dog or the soft footfalls of the night watch. Inside the palace, the halls are lit by flickering oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows. In the royal library, a scholar works late, his head bent over a scroll, the only sound the faint scratching of his pen. In the temples, the sacred fires are kept burning through the night, a silent vigil for the sleeping gods, both the ancient ones and the new ones who live in the palace. And perhaps, in your mind, you are beginning to drift as well. The details of the story may start to blur, the names and dates fading into a soft, indistinct landscape. That's all right. The purpose of this journey was not to memorize facts, but to feel the texture of a time and place, to listen to the echoes of a distant world, to understand that behind the grand titles and shocking headlines of history, there are always people making choices, driven by fear and hope, ambition and love. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, Arsinoe II, the brother-sister gods. Their story is a strange and compelling one, a testament to the endless complexity of the human experience. They sought to create a legacy of divine purity and eternal power. What they left behind is a fascinating, tangled, and deeply human story of a family and a kingdom caught between two worlds. They built their house on a foundation of gold and myth. For a time, it was the most magnificent house in the world. But like all houses, it was ultimately built on the shifting sands of time. So let the rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse guide you into sleep. Let the soft, warm air of the Egyptian night envelop you. There are no more stories to tell tonight. The library is closing. The gods are sleeping. The great, slow river of history flows on, carrying all its stories with it into the quiet sea of the past. The whispers of Ptolemy and Arsinoe, of their ambition and their strange love, fade into the gentle murmur of the waves. Rest now. The idea of marrying a sibling is so profoundly alien to most modern cultures that it's hard to look at the story of Ptolemy and Arsinoe without a sense of disbelief. It feels like a line has been crossed, a fundamental law of nature violated. And for the Greeks of their time, it felt that way too. That's what makes the story so powerful. It wasn't a casual, accepted practice that they were continuing. It was a deliberate, calculated transgression. Ptolemy II was not an ignorant man living in a primitive society. He was the ruler of the most cosmopolitan and intellectually advanced city on earth. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it would shock his fellow Greeks. And he did it anyway. This tells us something crucial about the nature of absolute power. When you are raised to believe you are not subject to the same rules as other mortals, when you are surrounded by a court that constantly reinforces your special status, your perspective on the world can become profoundly warped. The line between what is permissible for a man and what is permissible for a god begins to blur. For Ptolemy, the taboo against incest was a mortal concern. As a living god, a new Osiris, he was operating on a different plane of existence. The rules of men did not apply. This is, of course, a form of self-delusion, a grand piece of psychological architecture built to justify an act of political expediency. But he and his court may well have come to believe it. The human mind is very good at creating narratives that justify its actions, especially when those actions serve its own interests. The marriage was also a statement of ultimate control. It was Ptolemy declaring that his will, his dynastic needs, superseded even the most deeply ingrained social norms. It was an act of supreme confidence, or supreme arrogance. He was not just ruling his kingdom, he was defining its reality, reshaping its moral and religious landscape to suit his own design. He was telling the world, "I am the state, and I will do what is necessary to preserve it, no matter how strange it may seem to you." It's a kind of power that is both fascinating and terrifying to contemplate, a power that can rewrite the rules of family, religion, and society itself. The story is a reminder that the values we hold to be universal and self-evident are often culturally specific and historically contingent. For a brief, brilliant moment in history, on the sun-drenched coast of Egypt, a brother marrying his sister was not a taboo, but a sacrament, not a disgrace, but a path to divinity. And understanding how and why that came to be is to understand something profound about the relationship between power, culture, and belief. Let's think for a moment about the sounds of that world. Not just the grand sounds of a procession or the murmur of a crowd, but the quieter, more intimate sounds. The soft rustle of a linen tunic as someone walks down a cool, stone hallway in the palace. The gentle clinking of gold bracelets on Arsinoe's wrist as she gestures during a conversation. The quiet slosh of wine being poured from a clay amphora into a silver cup. The distant sound of a flute being played in the gardens. A melancholic Greek melody drifting on the evening air. These are the sounds that filled the spaces between the great historical events. They are the soundtrack of daily life. Imagine the sound of the Nile itself, the great, silent river that was the source of all life in Egypt. For most of the year, it is a placid, slow-moving giant. But during the inundation, the annual flood, it becomes a churning, powerful force, spreading its life-giving waters and rich black silt across the floodplain. The sound of the rising water, the lapping of the flood against the edge of the village, was a sound of hope and anxiety for every Egyptian. A good flood meant a good harvest. A weak flood meant hunger. A flood that was too high meant destruction. The entire rhythm of the country was dictated by this one great, natural pulse. The Ptolemies, for all their Greek sophistication, understood this. They knew that their power ultimately depended not on the library or their fleets, but on their ability to manage and harness the power of this river. They built canals and dikes. They measured the height of the flood with nilometers, and they used this data to set tax rates. They tried to impose their Greek sense of order onto this immense, ancient, natural cycle, but they never fully controlled it. They were always, in some sense, at its mercy. This relationship with the Nile is a metaphor for their relationship with Egypt itself. They could rule it, they could tax it, they could build on it, but they were always outsiders, living on the banks of a deep, mysterious cultural current that they never fully became a part of. The sibling marriage was their most dramatic attempt to bridge that gap, to tie themselves into the mythical origins of the land itself. It was an attempt to make the sound of their own dynasty harmonize with the ancient, powerful rhythm of the Nile. And what of love? It's the one word that is both central to their story. Their official title was the Sibling Lovers, and almost entirely absent from any serious historical discussion of their relationship. We talk about power, politics, propaganda, and religion. But was there love between Ptolemy and Arsinoe? It seems like a naive question, like trying to apply a modern, romantic lens to a cold, hard political calculation. And yet, they were human. It's hard to imagine that two people, sharing a life, a throne, and a bed, felt nothing for each other. Perhaps it wasn't the passionate, romantic love that our culture celebrates. Perhaps it was something else. A love born of shared experience, of mutual respect, of a deep and abiding trust in a world where trust was the rarest of commodities. Arsinoe, had seen the worst of human nature. She had been betrayed by husbands and brothers. In Ptolemy, her full brother, perhaps she found someone who would not and could not betray her, because their fates were now one. And for Ptolemy, in Arsinoe, he found not just a wife, but a partner who understood the burdens of rule in a way no outsider ever could. Maybe their love was a form of profound friendship, a deep alliance of two souls against the world. When he mourned her so extravagantly after her death, creating a divine cult in her honor and never remarrying, it's hard to dismiss that as pure politics. It feels personal. It feels like the act of a man who has lost his anchor, his other half. The historian's instinct is to be cautious, to avoid speculating about emotions we can never verify. But the storyteller's instinct is to acknowledge that these were people, not just chess pieces on a historical board. And people are creatures of emotion. Perhaps the most radical thing about their story is not the incest, but the possibility that it was, in its own strange way, a successful partnership. That in this most unnatural of unions, they found a kind of stability and companionship that had eluded them in their more conventional marriages. It's a strange and unsettling thought that a relationship we see as fundamentally broken could have been, for them, a source of strength and even affection. But the world of the Ptolemies was a strange and unsettling place. It forces us to question our own assumptions about what constitutes a family, a partnership, and a kingdom. The legacy of the Ptolemies is a mixed one. They were, without a doubt, successful rulers for a very long time. They kept Egypt peaceful and prosperous through one of the most chaotic periods of ancient history. They were patrons of a cultural and intellectual flowering in Alexandria that had a profound and lasting impact on the world. The work of scholars like Euclid and Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy, was only possible because of the resources and environment the Ptolemies created. They preserved and transmitted a huge amount of classical Greek literature that would otherwise have been lost. On that front, their legacy is overwhelmingly positive, but there is a darker side. Their rule was based on an exploitative colonial model. Their wealth was extracted from the labor of the Egyptian people, who saw little of the benefits that flowed into Alexandria. Their dynasty grew increasingly corrupt and decadent, tearing itself apart in a series of squalid civil wars. And their central tradition, the sibling marriage, which began as a clever political strategy, became a genetic and social poison that contributed to their eventual downfall. So how do we remember them? As enlightened patrons of the arts and sciences, or as decadent foreign tyrants? The answer, as is so often the case in history, is that they were both. They were complex and contradictory figures, capable of both great vision and great folly. Their story is not a simple morality play. It's a messy human drama, played out on a grand stage. As we let their story fade into the background, it's worth remembering this complexity. History is rarely about clear-cut heroes and villains. It's about flawed people making difficult choices in circumstances that are often beyond their control. The Ptolemies were trying to secure their legacy, to build something that would last. And in a way, they succeeded. Their dynasty is long gone, but their story, in all its strange and brilliant and terrible detail, endures. It continues to fascinate us, to puzzle us, and to remind us of the endless, surprising variety of the human experience. And now, it's time to let that story go. Let it become part of the quiet landscape of your sleep. The city of Alexandria that we have been visiting is now mostly lost. The ancient city lies buried beneath the modern one, or submerged beneath the waters of the harbor. The Pharos lighthouse collapsed in a series of earthquakes centuries ago. The great library and the Maushan are gone, their exact location still a matter of debate. The magnificent tomb of Alexander the Great, which Ptolemy I stole and made the sacred heart of his capital, has vanished without a trace. It is a ghost city. We can reconstruct it from ancient descriptions and archaeological fragments, but we can never walk its streets again. We can never smell the scent of papyrus in the library, or see the light of the Pharos on the water. This sense of loss, of something magnificent that has disappeared, is a part of the story too. There is a melancholy in thinking about all that lost knowledge, the thousands of scrolls that burned or decayed, the works of poets and playwrights and scientists that are gone forever. The Ptolemaic era was a time of incredible intellectual production, but only a fraction of it has survived. We have a few books from a library that was said to contain all the knowledge in the world. It's a humbling thought. It reminds us of the fragility of civilization, of how easily things can be lost. The Ptolemies themselves seemed to be obsessed with preservation. They preserved Alexander's body. They tried to preserve all the world's books, and they tried to preserve the purity of their own bloodline through the most extreme measures. But in the end, nothing can be preserved forever. Time is the great solvent. It wears away stone, it turns papyrus to dust, and it dissolves even the most powerful dynasties. The story of Ptolemy and Arsinoe is not just a story from the past, it's a story about the past, about the relentless, unstoppable process of change and decay. But it's also about what endures. What endures are the stories themselves. The memory of a queen who was also a goddess, and a king who married his sister to secure a kingdom. The memory of a city of light and learning. These things have survived, passed down through generations of storytellers and historians, faint but persistent echoes in the long corridor of time. And tonight, we have listened to those echoes together. As we reach the end of our journey, let the narrative slow down, like a boat drifting to a gentle stop on a quiet lake. The details of the story, the names of the kings and queens, the dates of the wars, can all recede. What remains is an impression, a feeling. The feeling of the hot Egyptian sun on marble, the cool, quiet air of the great library, the weight of a golden crown, the complex and perhaps unknowable emotions of a brother and sister who ruled a kingdom together. History is not always a lecture. Sometimes it is a dream of a time and place that is not our own, but which can still speak to us. The world of Ptolemaic Egypt was a world of great contrasts, of reason and superstition, of immense wealth and grinding poverty, of brilliant creativity and brutal violence. It was a world where a family of European conquerors remade themselves in the image of African gods. It was a world that was both ancient and new, a melting pot of cultures that produced something unique and unforgettable. The decision of Ptolemy II to marry his sister Arsinoe II was the catalyst for much of this. It was the strange seed from which much of the dynasty's character grew. It was an act that was both deeply conservative, in that it sought to preserve the purity of the family, and radically innovative, in that it created a new model of Hellenistic kingship. It is a story that defies easy categorization, and that is why it continues to hold our attention. It reminds us that the past is not a settled, predictable place. It is full of surprises, of people who made choices that we struggle to understand, of societies that operated on a logic that is not our own. And in exploring that strangeness, we learn something not just about them, but about the vast range of possibilities that human life contains. So now, there is nothing left to do but rest. Let the story dissolve, let the ancient world fade, allow your mind to be quiet and still. The journey is over, the night is deep, and sleep is waiting. The air is still. The final echoes of the story have faded. The only sound is the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. The characters we met, Ptolemy the scholar king, Arsinoe the survivor queen, Demetrios the scribe, Khenemun the priest, have all returned to the silence of the past. Their struggles, their ambitions, their triumphs, and their failures are all done. The great city of Alexandria is quiet, its marble streets bathed in moonlight. The harbor is calm, the ships at anchor like sleeping beasts. The great beacon of the pharaohs continues its silent, sweeping conversation with the stars. It is a world held in a perfect, peaceful stasis, a memory preserved in the amber of the night. There is a comfort in this stillness, a comfort in knowing that these ancient dramas are over. The frantic energy of their lives has resolved into the quiet dignity of history. They have played their parts on the stage, and now the curtain has fallen. Their story serves as a soft, distant backdrop for your own journey into sleep. It is a reminder that our own worries and concerns, which can feel so large and overwhelming in the middle of the night, are part of a much larger, longer story. We are all just a single sentence in the great book of time. The Ptolemies tried to write their own chapter in bold, golden letters, and for a while they succeeded. But eventually, their page was turned, just as all pages are. Let this thought be a source of peace. Let it untether you from the anxieties of the day. There is nothing you need to solve or figure out right now. The only task at hand is to let go, to allow the gentle current of sleep to carry you away from the shore of wakefulness, to drift into the quiet, restorative darkness. The story is complete, the night is yours, and all is well. Let the image of the Nile River be the final one in your mind, not the bustling river of commerce and conquest, but the river at night, a vast, dark ribbon of water flowing silently through the desert under a canopy of brilliant stars. The sky in the desert, away from the lights of the city, is a breathtaking spectacle. The Milky Way is a luminous cloud, and the constellations are sharp and clear. The ancient Egyptians were master astronomers. They knew this sky intimately. They saw their gods in it. They used it to measure time and to align their temples. For them, the sky was not a void. It was a living map of the divine. The river below reflects this sky, creating a world of perfect symmetry. The stars above and the stars below, the heavens and the earth, joined by the silent, sacred river. This was the cosmic order that the pharaohs and the Ptolemies who followed them were supposed to uphold. Their role was to maintain the harmony between the human world and the divine world, to keep the fragile balance of the universe intact. The sibling marriage, in their view, was part of this. It was an act that mirrored the union of the gods, an act that affirmed the divine order on earth. It was their way of ensuring that the river would continue to flow, that the stars would stay in their courses, and that their kingdom would endure. It was a heavy burden to place on a single relationship, a single family, and ultimately, it was a burden they could not sustain. But for a moment, in this quiet, final scene, we can appreciate the grandeur of their vision. We can see the world as they might have seen it, a sacred landscape, animated by divine forces, where the actions of a king and queen could echo in the heavens. And now, let this river carry you. Let it flow gently through your mind, washing away the remnants of the day. Let it carry you down its long, slow, winding path, deeper and deeper into a state of peaceful, effortless rest. The river knows the way. Just follow its current. There is nowhere else you need to be. The quiet of the desert night. It is a profound and absolute silence, unlike the quiet of a city. There are no distant sirens, no hum of traffic. There is only the vast, empty space, the sand, and the stars. It is a silence that can feel ancient, as if you are listening to the sound of time itself. In this silence, the small sounds become magnified. The whisper of the wind over a sand dune, the faint, dry rustle of a scorpion skittering over the sand, your own heartbeat. This is the world that existed before the Ptolemies, and the world that remained long after they were gone. The eternal, unchanging backdrop of the desert. The Ptolemies built their glittering, Greek-speaking cities on the edge of this vastness. Their world was one of noise, of commerce, of argument, of poetry and politics. But they were always aware of the great silence that lay just beyond the cultivated fields of the Nile Valley. It was the realm of chaos, of death, of the forces that threatened the fragile order of their kingdom. This contrast between the vibrant life of the Nile Valley and the stark emptiness of the desert was fundamental to the Egyptian worldview. It was the contrast between order and chaos, life and death, creation and oblivion. The pharaoh's job was to stand on the border between these two worlds and keep chaos at bay. By reenacting the myths of the gods, by maintaining the sacred rituals, he kept the forces of dissolution from overwhelming the created world. The Ptolemies inherited this role, and perhaps their embrace of the sibling marriage, their creation of a divinely insular family, was their way of building a wall against the chaos. They created a perfect, self-contained world in the palace, a microcosm of divine order, hoping it would radiate outwards and protect their kingdom. It was a magical, rather than a political, way of thinking, a testament to how deeply the ancient mindset of Egypt had penetrated the Greek consciousness of its rulers. Let this great silence of the desert be a comfort to you now. It is a silence that absorbs all noise, all worry, It is a vast, empty canvas on which you can rest your mind. There is nothing to hold on to, nothing to resist, just the deep, peaceful, and profound silence of the ancient night. Let's return, one last time, to that balcony in Alexandria. The night is almost over. The sky in the east is beginning to lighten, shifting from black to a deep, velvety blue. The stars are starting to fade. The great beam of the pharaoh seems paler now, its work nearly done. A cool, fresh breeze is blowing in from the sea, carrying the scent of salt and the promise of a new day. The city below is still asleep. It is the quietest hour, the moment between the darkness of the night and the light of the dawn. It is a moment of perfect peace, of transition. In a few hours, the city will wake up. The merchants will open their stalls. The ships will raise their sails. The scholars will return to their scrolls. The great, noisy, vibrant machine of the city will roar back to life. But for now, there is only this gentle, quiet moment. This is the gift of history, too. It allows us to visit these worlds, to immerse ourselves in their dramas and their beauty, and then to return to our own time. We can be grateful for the journey, for the glimpse into a lost world, without having to bear the weight of its burdens. We can appreciate the story of Ptolemy and Arsinoe without having to live in their dangerous, demanding world. Our journey with them is over. We have followed their story from the battlefield to the palace, from the library to the temple. We have tried to understand their motives, to feel the texture of their world, and now we can let them go, leaving them here, on their balcony, forever looking out over their magnificent city as a new day dawns. Let this feeling of peaceful transition guide you. If you are still awake, know that the dawn is coming for you too. A new day, fresh and full of possibility. But if you are asleep, let this be the final, gentle push into the deepest, most restorative rest. The story has found its end. The night has found its dawn. And you have found your peace. The first rays of the sun are now touching the top of the pharaoh's lighthouse, turning the marble to a soft, rosy pink. The light creeps down its length, chasing the shadows away. It spills across the harbor, making the water glitter. It illuminates the rooftops of Alexandria, one by one. The city is waking up. A baker is firing up his oven, the smell of wood smoke mingling with the sea air. A fisherman is mending his nets on the quay. The first few carts are beginning to rattle down the Canopic Way. A new day has begun in the city of Alexander. For the people of this city, the story of their king and queen is not a story. It is their reality. The coins in their pockets, the temples where they pray, the very name of their queen's cult are all part of the fabric of their daily lives. They live inside the world that Ptolemy and Arsinoe created. For us, it has been a journey into the past, a story to help us sleep. But for them, it was just life. This is the final, gentle irony to ponder as we depart. Our sleep story was their waking reality. Our fascinating historical curiosity was their political and religious firmament. It's a good reminder of the gap that always exists between history as it is lived and history as it is told. We can never fully bridge that gap, but in trying to, we find empathy, understanding, and a deeper appreciation for the endless complexity of the human journey. The sun is higher now. The day has truly begun. Our time in the past is over. It is time to return to the present, to the quiet comfort of your own bed, in your own time. The world of the Ptolemies is once again a distant echo, a story whispered from a world away. Let it be a pleasant memory, a faint and peaceful resonance in the back of your mind as you drift, or as you wake. Thank you for traveling back with us tonight. May your rest be deep, and your dreams be sweet.